Hey, Battletech fans, I wanted to start a new conversation with you. I enjoyed all of our conversations up to this point, and I've been away for a little while. Work has been kind of kicking my butt slowly, but there's a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel there. So I'm back at it and had some time to kind of think and reflect about the next conversation I wanted to have with you. And love to get your inputs, both veteran and novice player. And the conversation I wanted to kind of kick off today was about terrain. So we talk a lot about the mechs, we talk a lot about the game mechanics, we talk a lot about the sexier aspects of the game, but terrain to me is always the terrain and the board to me is always kind of the third player or something that you need to kind of think about because that's going to affect a lot of what you do on the table, and it keeps things exciting, it keeps them interesting, it keeps them differing and changing and all that good stuff. So I want to talk about terrain, how you use it, and explore that space of the Battletech game. And for the purposes of this conversation, we'll assume either a hex map or a traditional wargaming table, um, but fully 3D terrain, not just the elevation changes printed on the hex map. Though I suppose you could consider that, but really you probably want to bring the 3D terrain, whether it be hexes with actual elevation or on a regular wargaming table. And if given the chance you do that, and you do use a regular 3D wargaming table, I really encourage that. It's pretty awesome. But the goal of this conversation is to discuss how you approach terrain to your games and maybe give a little thoughts or insight as to how I approach it, and we can kind of riff off of each other. And of course, you might be able to do pickup games where you have a force of your own and your opponent has a force, and you set up a gaming table with something that looks cool. Or maybe this is part of a campaign where you set some things up in advance where there's a general notion of that terrain should look like in the city terrain or wooded or ice planet or whatever you have there. So one thing that I think about is good to think about in your repertoire of when you're thinking about the terrain is whatever war game you're playing, and BattleTech is no exception, is your intentions. What is your intention setting up the table? What story are you trying to say? And what kind of experience are you trying to get at? Are you looking for 100% symmetry so you have a totally fair, quote unquote, engagement? Both sides have an equal opportunity or equal disadvantage. Are you looking for an asymmetric mission where one side maybe has unfavorable terrain and the other side does not? Like maybe one side is defending a city and the other side is advancing, and they're white in the open, and it's the charge of the cavalry, and the you know famous last stand, and can they make it? So think about that in terms of like what is it you're trying to get stylistically? Is this an objective game? You have to pay special attention to where objectives are and how the terrain supports or doesn't support that mission and accessible and equal to all sides or not. So that's one thing. It's like the intention of what the game is supposed to feel like. So let's explore this a little bit around different ways to attack that. And when it comes to terrain, the big questions to me are what type and how much. Those are the two big questions. But at the end of the day, it really kind of boils down to how much for me. That's the number one thing. And how much is really going to flavor the experience you're going to have with that game. The what type can be a little bit variable. Like you can have the how much conversation, and it can be of different types. Like maybe it's buildings, maybe it's mountains, maybe it's trees, maybe it's cliffs or hills or whatnot. And the what type can be, like I said, pretty variable. Um, but the how much is the primary question to me. And so let's hit the what type in a minute, but in a hot sec, but let's go to the how much first. So how much terrain? It's hard to talk specifics here, so we'll go into maybe some generalities as I see them. I tend to like a lot of terrain, sometimes maybe too much, maybe, but I like lots of line of sight blocking stuff, some low stuff, some high stuff, and some stuff in between. And the stuff that makes you move around the board and do some positioning is really kind of what makes the game exciting to me. If it's just a shooting gallery, like a wide open table with nothing there to block the guns, it's basically like how hot am I rolling versus how hot are you rolling. You can do that. Not particularly exciting long term, at least for me. Now, having a lot of terrain on the flip side is not always a good thing because that can affect the game in different other ways. Too much terrain has the potential to really slow down the game. Think about it. If you've got so much terrain and all the mechs are on the slower side, it's going to be very hard to line up a shot. Or if you do get line of sight, if you have either tight lanes of fire that don't have much range, you're really going to favor mechs that are either fast or have jump jets, or it's going to be perhaps over-indexing to who won initiative. On the flip side, having too little or no terrain is not a whole lot of fun either. Just like we mentioned, completely open table. It's just a blast fest where basically gives your heavies and your assaults and mechs a good amount of weaponry every range band. Essentially, it's a shooting gallery, and it'll just be down to attrition and how good you're rolling. And lights would have a very hard time surviving that sort of game, save for their speed. But again, there's nowhere to hide. So I don't know that that's very fun. So obviously, there's those two extremes, but what's the middle ground, right? And how much do you want to move that slider towards the middle ground? I think a first good middle ground rule, at least for me, maybe more of a guideline is, and again, this is just for me, I want to hear your thoughts on this, is a discussion around you certainly want to think hard about any wide open fire corridors that span the board. To me, having level one terrain around sporadically is good because that helps with things like leg hits or maneuvering, and maybe giving you a little bit of cover. But it doesn't really necessarily count as disrupting full table length of fire lanes to me. So yes, you should have level one terrain or one level up from the baseline level of the terrain, and you can still hit things, but you're still going to get some cover. I'm talking more about at least a few good sized level two blocks and here and there that will disrupt line of sight for the majority of the table. Now, given that not all weapons are going to be able to reach all the way across the table, it's still something you want to think about. Having wide open channels of fire for every single angle will likely get you into that shooting gallery territory. So to me, guideline one, break up the table with some well-spaced, at least level two areas of terrain or above mechs that can fully hide behind them and dissuade players from just sitting back and being immobile and blasting from long range. So it encourages some maneuverability, but not overly restricting long range fire. Another guideline I like to think about is some variety or interest. One type of terrain makes a pretty dull looking board. So even within kind of categories, you might want to think about mixing it up. And I'd like to pick from a few different categories. I think a few key categories to mix and match are things like hills and trees and buildings and rivers and lakes and oceans or what have you. Now, obviously, you're going to want to make a theme or you're going to want to make it look cohesive and tie it all together. But think about a few different categories to give the table some interest. Visual appeal, at least to me, is a big reason to play the game. And there's some amazing terrain out there. Steel Warrior Studios, Hardware Studios, a bunch of other places. There's some amazing terrain out there you can, or obviously you can make your own, explore building tables with a few different categories of this terrain. Obviously increases interest and makes it a lot more fun to watch. I would say don't do all different categories on one terrain necessarily because it can get either really busy, really jumbled, or non-cohesive. But just kind of take a step back and look at your table and look at the aesthetics of it, because that's, to me at least, that's a big part of the game. And in your eyes, and how do you consider tying all those elements together into one cohesive thing with maybe more than one element type? Um, the next thing I like to think about is the overall height of the terrain and how close you put your bigger pieces together. Now, this is particularly interesting when you're putting buildings together for a big city tech type of battle. Now, you could put a bunch of skyscrapers or some larger hills together that are very tall, but thinking about how all those put together to keep your jump capable units from having a job to do something fun. If the buildings or the terrain is all way too tall, it's going to limit your jump capability because part of the fun is jumping over those things, not just around them. So a mix of heights, not just level twos and level ones, but if you're going to have some of that bigger stuff, it is pretty cool to have buildings or hills that your jumpers can't jump over, and then some things that you can. So that kind of gives your jump capable units a job to do, as well as a pivotal role in the game. So something else to think about. Another thing that I like to think of in terms of elevations is thinking about the sheerness of the hills if you're using hills or natural elevation changes. Like if it's a straight goes from level 0 to level 5, that's one thing. Or if it goes like a 2, a 1, a 2, a 4, and a 5, having some Gradation of those hills also gives some fun or interesting little things to do on or around those hills. So, assuming you have enough movement points to kind of navigate those, mechs can only traverse an elevation level change of +2 vertical levels if they're walking. Jumping is obviously different. But if you have next level terrain or 3 or more elevation changes between 1 hex to the next or 1 inch to the next, the mech can't do that scaling of the surface with just its legs. So now you might be able to jump over it, but you won't necessarily have the ability to walk or run around it. So you can kind of create these channels of movement to funnel the game or funnel the gameplay of the game. So having some of those sorts of channels and multi-levels on a single piece of elevated terrain is kind of fun. And maybe it's a good thing and maybe it's not, depending on what you're intending to do. But think of even individual pieces of sort of microcosms of gameplay that you can kind of play on or around. So those are some of my initial thoughts on how you kind of approach terrain in your Battletech game. And so I'd love to hear from veteran players and maybe the newbie players as well. And if you've got a few new games under your belt, what are your thoughts playing hex maps versus open, wargaming tables, 3D terrain versus 3D hexes? How do you like to mix things up? How do you approach designing your boards for maximum fun and interest? So give me your thoughts and comments. Love to hear what you guys do when you approach terrain for your Battletech games.